Welcome, welcome. Go ahead in the chat box and type for us where you're from and what do you hope to learn? You volunteered to give your time to us today, which we're very excited about being in community with you for the next 45 minutes. What do you hope to learn during our time together? And if you have your cell phone, you can scan the QR code there and it will take you to our social media, in particular our LinkedIn page. And you will be able to follow us on LinkedIn as we will share resources that we didn't get a chance to share during this webinar, as well as additional sources of support for your leadership for equity journey. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead and continue to drop in the chat box, where are you from and what do you hope to learn? Give these coming in. Okay. I love this. Continue. Go ahead and continue to drop it in the chat box. Just one housekeeping for folks who are wanting to type messages. If you click everyone, that will allow your message to show up to everyone. And then any questions you may have that arise throughout the session, you can add them to the Q&A. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so excited that you all are here to join us. Please, in the chat box, go ahead and drop where you're from and what do you hope to learn in the chat box. Welcome, welcome, everybody in the chat box. Go ahead and drop where you're from and what do you hope to learn during our time together. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Annice Fisher, and I am the founder and CEO of Developing Capacity Coaching. And I want to officially welcome you to our Leading for Anti-Racism and Equity webinar series. We created this series in March of 2023, and we did it because we noticed a lot of organizations were backing up from their commitment to equity and justice. And as a part of our vision to create a world where people have the resources and tools to lead for anti-racism and equity, we wanted to create a bank of resources and support at no cost to people so that folks can feel like they have strategies and tools to continue to lead this work, whether or not their organization has opted to continue to focus in on equity and inclusion. And our session today is going to be on I acted with racism. So how do you respond when you realize that you are a perpetrator of racism? I witnessed racism. How do you respond when you're a bystander to racism? And then I survived racism. We have 3 esteemed panelists that are going to be a part of this panel a little bit later. If they can come on camera. Dr. Dee Tejada is a grassroots organizer turned school-based educator turned extraordinaire. Dee and I have been walking together for the past 3 years. Dee has come alongside DCC and designed curriculum for us, has taught our conscious leadership class, and also really was the launcher and designer with me for our Be Free Coaches Academy. So, and then Dee, within their own right, is just an amazing powerhouse grassroots organizer. We have Dr. Sherry Travers, whose work sits at the intersection of conscious leadership, equity, and reform in the justice environment, and also this concept of systems thinking. She's the virtual program leader for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. And then we have Kathy Tan, MA, who is the founder and CEO of Amalu Coaching, has had a lot of experience in the DEI space and developing councils and education, but has recently founded her own entity, Amalu Coaching, which focuses on healing and justice and restoration from violence within AAPI communities and others. I'm going to tell you much more about these brilliant folks a little bit later, but I just wanted you to say hello to them. And they're going to fade to the back for a little bit, and I'm going to give you a little mini workshop, and then they'll come back on and share their experiences. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you a little bit later when you come back on camera. I want to start with a solidarity acknowledgement, And our solidarity acknowledgement does a few things. What it says is that as a company, developing capacity coaching stands in solidarity with our global family. We want to see the end of pain for all forms of oppression. That's everything from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia to anti-Arab racism to anti-Blackness to xenophobia against our brothers and sisters that are coming into the country. So we want to see that end across. And we believe solidarity is the path forward to dismantling the interlocking systems of oppression. And so what that means is that we are empathetic to our brothers and sisters on their community-specific quest for liberation. I don't have to be Jewish to stand in alignment with my Jewish brothers who want to end anti-Semitism. I don't have to be Palestinian to stand in alignment with my Palestinian brothers and sisters who want freedom. So we are empathetic to their struggle. We believe we have to work together to live in a world where we are all humanized and our dignity is honored. And so what we're trying to do here is to build a multi-sector, multi-generational, intersectional global movement, which means that we work across sector in DCC. We have people of various ages, and we believe in this intersectionality of identities and supporting those intersectionalities in order to get to a world that's more free, that's more healed, and more just. And so I want to invite you to come into the space. Thank you all for dropping in the chat box. What do you want to get out of this session? Feel free to keep dropping that. We always like to start our work with centering ourselves with 3 deep breaths. And we do that because many of us came from meetings, or you might have just come out of a tense situation, and we want you to bring yourselves into this place. So I'm going to lead you through 3 breaths, just basic inhales and exhales. You don't have to hold your inhale as long as I hold it. The point is just for you to breathe. So go ahead and take a deep breath in. Exhale. Take a deep breath in. Exhale. We'll take another deep breath in. Exhale. Okay. Hope you had a chance just to still yourself. During our time today, we're going to define racism, and we're going to talk about how you disrupt these 3 levels. And then we're going to show you how our 4-step consciousness raising process begins the process of reconciliation and making amends for racial harm. Just something you should know about us with developing capacity. That's our mission and vision and our focus areas. These workshops are a part of what we consider to be build equity culture. So in these workshops, we're teaching people how to shift your organizational culture to one that centers equity and justice. And you will experience a couple of different things here. You'll experience capacity building. You will leave this session feeling like I can do this. You'll experience the coach in me and our panelists giving you some level of empowerment and saying, you can do this. And then data informed. You'll notice the 4-step process will slow you down to think about how you can use the data around you to be more thoughtful in your interactions. And so at the end of our time, you will get a blueprint, and the blueprint will be a 1-page handout, which will allow you to take the framework of the 4-step process from those 3 different areas and implement that. You can share it with your people. You can use it for your own in-service. I just always say, cite Black women. We just wanted to ground the group in sort of these terms that you hear flying around. For us, equity is about all members, regardless of your race, class, gender, sexual orientation. You have full access and equal access within your organization. Full means there's no barrier. Equal access means there's no racial, gender disparities to participate in, right? And benefit from. So it's not just enough to give people access to something, they should be able to benefit from the resources. In order to get equity, we have to dismantle systems that are a threat to inclusion and belonging. We have to disrupt the status quo, but we have to be willing to rebuild for equity. So the 4 steps that we're going to talk about today they're a process of disruption, harm, right? They're a process of trying to dismantle racism in your organization, but it's all a part of trying to rebuild a space so that people are heard, seen, and respected. When you hear people define and talk about the term anti-racism, it's one form of equity, and it's specifically focused on race. It's focused on moving away from only focusing in on censoring white perspectives to saying we need to honor the humanity of all racial groups. And it's a work towards having true interracial solidarity. How do you know that happens? When white folks and people of color, they feel heard, seen, respected, they get promoted, and they have authority in your organization. If you can answer that on 5 different directions, you're starting to have anti-racism be the core of who you are. Ultimately, everything we do is in service of my framework, Conscious Leadership for Equity, which is a way of life. It's a set of conscious practices. We're going to teach you 4 of those practices today. And it's about understanding your identity as a Black woman, as a Latina, as an Afro-Latina, as an Asian male. Understanding your identity and the role socialization has played in your life, the programming that you got as a kid from the media that might be showing up in how you interact with people, which means you might be intentionally doing racism or you might be unintentionally doing it. It's about trusting your authority to take action. This is the coaching us. You're going to get these 4 steps because we don't think you need to wait to call the DEI officer. We need you to have love inside of you and take action. We need you to not collude with inequity. And so part of this is about being true to what you say and having integrity. If we say that we want to be an organization that's aspiring to be anti-racist or an organization that centers equity, that means that what you say on your papers have to match what you do in your actions. And then lastly, we say it's important to have sanctuaries. That means it's important to have practices where you actually lean in and tend to yourself, whether it's writing, jogging, whether it's prayer, meditation. You got to feed your soul in this work. Here are the 3 different ways that we're going to talk about racism today. And I'm going to just quickly define our definition of racism so that we're all on the same page. This is my offering. I'm not going to go back and forth with folks about is it not, is it? This is how we're talking about it in this context. Racism is what happens is when you begin to center the supremacy of whiteness, this picture right here. And what happens with racism is that people start to internalize belief systems that prioritize white cultural perspectives. So and then it gets perpetuated by racial microaggressions, thoughts of internalized superiority, or other acts of racialized violence. Then those beliefs, people start creating systems of race advantage and disadvantage. That's when you get disparities. When you have a disparity or overrepresentation of one race over, a lack of folks of color in your management roles, you have a disparity. That's because at some point in your organization, a system of advantage and disadvantage has been set up on race. And what happens is the closer you are in proximity to whiteness, the more advantages you get in access to privileges. And that's how you get structural racism, because those beliefs of folks start to design the systems and structurally racism gets embedded in. But then we also have cultural racism. And this is when we ask people of color to adopt white cultural norms. For example, how you communicate. You must speak in this way. You cannot wear your hair naturally. You should not wear big gold earrings, Annice, that's unprofessional. When we begin to start to ask people of color to begin to act like the norm, and if that norm is whiteness, then we're perpetuating cultural racism. And what happens is that you have to change in order to get access to organizational benefits. And the one way you can tell whether or not this is happening is if you close your eyes and look at your policies and processes and how you tell people to behave. Close your eyes, read those things, and what race of the person pops up to fit that standard. That's how you know cultural racism is built in. If you close your eyes and you read all the specs, and you're like, what would be the race of that person? And if they need to act a certain way. And then what happens is how racism gets sustained is because white people and folks of color begin to exploit their authority to preserve unfair systems. This is what happens when you speak out against racism and then they stop inviting you out to the happy hour. Or you speak out against racism and now your supervisor says that you have 3 things that you need to do better in your job when they've never given you feedback before. This is what happens when you confront a friend at work and all of a sudden the person doesn't want to talk to you anymore and they're disagreeing with everything you say at a meeting. That level of punishment is to snap you back into purpose, to say, you tried to disrupt the system. So I'm going to punish you. And the feeling of punishment is what keeps people silent. And so you don't speak out anymore. And that's how the system gets sustained. And so what happens is that that's a fear-based response. When people do that, it's because they don't want to lose privilege or control. Go ahead and put it in the chat box if you've seen any of these things happening in your organization or in other places. Let me know that I'm not just talking to myself here. Okay. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the 4-step process. I love it. You all are proud participation. I love it. Thank you all. So we're going to talk about this from when you perpetuate racism, when you witness it, and how to support survivors. The first thing is, if you have perpetuated racism, you have to make a choice to say, I'm going to change, and I want to learn how I perpetuate racism. You have to make a choice, because when someone tells you you've done something that's racist, you're going to either make the choice not to change and ignore them, or you're going to make a choice to say, let me lean in and learn. The second thing is you're going to slow down and be more present. You got to check in with yourself and say, let me be honest with myself and admit that I made a mistake. And you know that you have the power to make amends and reconcile, but that's on you. But when you find out, you got to make the choice to say, I want to learn how I'm perpetuating it. Then you want to be honest about and admit it, because the first step to being able to reconcile with somebody is to admit and acknowledge your harm. The second thing is you want to go deep to yourself with self-awareness, and you want to ask yourself, man, what am I feeling about the fact that someone just told me that what I did was racist? Then you want to ask yourself, what mindsets led me to behave this way? You do the self-awareness in your own time. You want to get, why did I do this? How did my actions hurt Kathy? And how was this action a betrayal of my values? And why is it important for me to lean into the discomfort and learn from the survivor? What often happens is people don't, when you confront them with their racism, you know, you all heard the intent versus impact, where the person keeps staying in their intentions, but they don't want to lean into the discomfort and learn from the survivor. And this self-awareness piece is really important. That's why you need to say, why is it important for me to listen to Millicent when she tells me that she experienced racism? And then the last step is intentionality. You have to be courageous and pursue reconciliation, which means you have to repent. And I'm using the word repent intentionally. It has no religious connotation. The word repent means to turn around from your actions. You can't perpetuate racism on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and apologize to me every day and then think that I'm going to believe you on Thursday that you're not trying to harm me. Repentance means that you stop doing the behavior. And part of that means you have to apologize to people you've hurt, listen to them when they tell you how you've impacted them, and you have to be willing to unlearn your racist behaviors. So when you realize this mindset leads me to say these microaggressions, I need to do the personal work to not say that anymore. I might have to get an equity leadership coach. I might have to go to some trainings. I might need to do some additional work, because the unlearning is on your end, not the end of folks of color. But these are the 4 steps for when you perpetuate racism. You're the perpetrator. And again, you will get this in a handout that will be dropped in here in about 15 minutes. So if you don't get everything down. The next thing is you witness racism. And there's 2 different ways that you can interrupt here. You can disrupt in the moment, and you can disrupt after the fact. We want to share both with you. In the moment, you also have to make a choice to trust yourself to use your power. You slow down in that moment and get present and say, what was unfair about this? Why did this rub me the wrong way? And then you have to say, what was it? Was it a microaggression? What happened? Even if you don't know the type of racism, you can still disrupt it. But you might ask yourself, what did I see? Or you might say, like, what was off about this? And then you have to do something, people. And we call our intentionality a love intervention, because we love you enough than to leave you where you are. And these are 3 ways you can intervene. There's probably more that you have on your own, but here's our 3. 1, sometimes the moment calls for you to directly challenge racism. The moment calls for you to say, look, us targeting hiring people of color is not reverse racism. We want to reflect the people that we work with. That's a direct challenge. You're not arguing, not going back and forth. But those of us who are a little risk adverse, you might try reflecting. You might repeat the statement. Targeting hiring people of color is a form of racism. Can you help me to understand why targeted hiring is racist? And that's a microaggression because we're invalidating the barriers that people of color face. So you can repeat the statement and ask someone a question. Can you help me to understand is a great way to ask a question when you feel like you want to have an explosive response. And then the next thing is questioning. You can use a series of questions. So if someone says target hiring for people of color, form of racism, you can say, can you tell me more? What kinds of experiences make you believe this? And how might your experiences affect your perception? And so what questioning does is kind of slows people down and gets them to be more thoughtful about what they say, because sometimes people don't think about what they say and they're not expecting you to respond to them. They're expecting to say what they want to say and everything goes by. The next one is all of these still are the same four choices. The eyewitness racism, the check-in afterwards. And the choice and the presence and the self-awareness pretty much stays the same. Use your power, slow down. But the self-awareness here begins to get you to think about how can my honesty help heal the perpetrator and the survivor? So in this case, you don't just check in with the person who got harmed. We want you to check in with the perpetrator. We want you to check in with the survivor and ask, what do they need? How can you support them? And then we want you to check in with the perpetrator and say, hey, Johnny, when you said targeted hiring is a form of racism, that sounded like a microaggression and it had this impact on me. Now, I don't want to assume that you're out here just dealing microaggressions on a daily basis. So help me to understand what happened. Hear them out. And then say, what can we do to repair the harm to D who experienced this? So here's an opportunity for you to script this out. You can screenshot this if you like, but what we're trying to give you is sort of a play-by-play because people often say, I don't know what to do or I'm doubtful about my capability. And what these four-step pathways do, and you'll get them again on the handout as well, is they give you a strategy, make a choice, be present, get aware, say something. Make a choice, get present, be aware, say something. And the last piece is for our survivors. And I want you to, we include this because for us, we often leave out survivors of racism. We want to disrupt Bobby, who says the racist comment. We want to clap back at Susie, but we don't lean in and support the survivor. And so this is if you're a person that has survived racism, and we use the word survive intentionally because it's an act of violence. You have to, number one, choose to believe yourself. Trust your spirit. You don't need anybody to validate that you just experienced racism. You were treated unfairly, and that's not okay. The second is we want you to be present and check in with yourself and take time to tend to yourself. You do not have to ignore anything or act like business as usual. If you need a minute, you need a minute. Even if the perpetrator comes to you and said, I want to process this right now, you can say, you know what, John, I don't have the capacity right now because I'm really hurt. Can we connect tomorrow? I'll reach out to you. That's your right. You don't have to make amends in the moment if you need more time as a survivor. And then you got to ask yourself, what am I feeling? And what do I need to feel comfortable again? Because we encourage people to set their boundaries. Name the injustice you experience. You're not bonkers, right? You'd experience an injustice. What is it going to take for you to feel comfortable? What is it going to take for you to heal? Do you need an apology? Do you need your supervisors to address this behavior is not appropriate at a meeting? What do you need? And take time to answer those questions. But then if you decide that you want to speak up, it's an act of courage and vulnerability. And you get to choose if you want to report it. You can report it to your HR or supervisor. Or if you want to speak to the perpetrator because you said, you know what, I'm not taking this from Bobby at another meeting. You can go and use the protocol that we call SBI. Situation, describe what happened. At the meeting, Bobby, you called me an angry Latina. Describe the racist behavior. You know, you called me an angry Black woman at the staff meeting. We were in the middle of having a discussion about how we were going to allocate our resources. It had a negative impact on me. I felt unseen. I felt unheard. I felt disrespected. And can you help me to understand what warranted this behavior from you? Because if we're going to work in community together, that's not going to work for me. And so part of why we ask you above, what are your boundaries and what do you need to feel comfortable with so that you can feel comfortable when you go and speak to someone. And again, this isn't linear and it happens in 10 minutes. Some of these questions take you time to answer. But whether or not you choose to speak up, we want you to know that nobody needs to validate that you have had experienced racism. Believe yourself. But we do want you as a survivor to think about this pathway. And so I know I went through that pretty quickly. We're going to hop over to the panel. But if you have any questions, go ahead and start to put your questions in the chat box. And I'm going to invite our panelists to come on. We have Dr. D. Tejada, which I shared with you, is a grassroots community organizer, school-based educator, and Dr. D's experience has been at the intersection of abolitionist pedagogy, liberation, and their work has spanned from higher ed to charter district and incarcerated settings, as well as nonprofits. Dr. Travers' experience intersects systems thinking, trauma-informed practices, conscious leadership, and using DEI to transform policies, practices, and instruction. Kathy Tanner is the founder of Amalu Coaching. She's a seasoned professional and personal development coach with over 7 years dedicated to helping individuals authentically live in confidence. Her new work is focusing on empowering and changing safe spaces that are impacting by Asian American Pacific Islanders and beyond who have survived abuse within their families. Gonna go ahead and invite the panelists to come on and stop sharing my screen so that you can see their brilliant faces. And I'm gonna go ahead and get started with just one pre-scripted questions, and then we'll take it from there. Go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. The first question is, how did you learn to recognize your biases and racism with other people? How did you start to recognize these things in you? We're going to start with Dr. D, and then we'll work our way down. And I'm going to enable captions so that people can have some captions here.
Perfect. Are they on now? So before I start? Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. The easy answer is self-awareness, but that self-awareness came with a lot of things. So both being able to understand the systems and structures where I am experiencing privilege and being able to understand the systems and structures where I'm marginalized, and how sometimes, right, it's easy to sit with the pieces that are most salient for us, which are the places where we're marginalized. And then we tend to forget that, like, you hold privilege in these areas. So being aware of what my positionality is in the world in general, and then how that shifts based on the spaces that I'm in, has been a major part of how I was able to be more aware of how and when I'm then leveraging my privilege and using my privilege, and when I'm not, so that then I'm able to be more conscious about when those moments of racism, colorism, and all of the other isms may show up, either in my behavior or even just like the ways that I could have acted in ways that were complacent with those systems of oppression. So that's the easy answer.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's go with Dr. Sherry, and then we'll close with Kathy.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. And I would agree with Dr. D that the very first step for me in recognizing my own bias that clearly had racist implications, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally, that was the product of my bias. And having to come face to face with that was a process for me. As Dr. Fisher said, I was a public school teacher before I became an educator in an incarcerated setting. And I was often invited to tables and having a voice in making decisions where I really needed to check myself. And I had to ask myself the questions of exactly who is being invited to this conversation, who is being represented in the choices that are being made, and how are people being represented in these choices? Are they having a voice in the choices? And that for me was a first step. And we often talk about our positionality, recognizing how we are showing up. And that is a constant steady for me, just stepping back and saying, okay, how are you showing up? What are you representing? What are you presenting? And are you inviting others?
Would you like me to go? Okay. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. So for me, two areas that really supported me in recognizing my own biases were one, the trainings. I used to be in education-based nonprofit, and we would have trainings, consistent trainings that were mandatory, DEIB trainings, and just those conversations with colleagues, those honest conversations were really helpful, and having a more proactive approach, right? And having a DEI expert. We didn't use DCC at the time, which I wish that we would have known DCC at the time, but we had an external expert who came in and she really guided the conversation. She gave us definitions, she educated us, we normalized these conversations and didn't shame anyone. So I thought that was very helpful. And then second, similar to what others had shared too, was just through my own personal experiences. I have background of managing people and teams at the time and managing partnerships. And so I had to do a lot of that self-reflective work, you know, when I was getting feedback from direct reports, right? And they were having those hard conversations with me. I had, you know, there are moments where I didn't receive it at the time, right? But then I had to do that self-work and really think about, okay, what trends am I hearing, you know, from this feedback that I'm receiving. And so, yeah, I feel like I'm doing better now, but I'm still on that journey.
Thank you. Thank you all. Great stuff here. Let us know in the chat box if what they're saying is resonating with you. The next question, and these are all questions we got prior to with registration. So we're going to answer a few of those and then we'll take a few of yours that are in the chat box. What steps do you take to support survivors of racism and also encourage people who perpetrate racism to make amends? Because those are two important things in the environment, right? Like one is the recognition and disruption, but how do you bring along the perpetrator? Because there needs to be a pathway to restoration. We can't leave folks out there in the cold. And then how do you support survivors? We'll start with Kathy and work our way to Dr. Sherry and then Dr. D.
Yeah, so in the work that I do, one of the values with my own business is having it be survivor-centered. So number one, checking in with the survivor, right? And really centering them and have that active listening, asking them what they need. Sometimes I think that oftentimes we may think we know what they need, right? Or especially if we're really close to the person, we may try to offer different resources, but specifically centering them and asking them, what support do you need, right? Maybe they just need somebody to listen. Maybe you're going to be there to empower them to report what happened to them, right? But just being that listening ear and really centering them, I would say is the first step. A framework that's helped me in the past, it's called VAR, but it's validate, appreciate, and refer, right? Validate what they're saying, believe them, number one, right? Appreciate, hey, I appreciate you opening up and sharing what happened to you, right? And then referring them to the right resources based on what they share that they need.
And building.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you mention also perpetrators as well, Dr. Fisher, or just survivor?
I said survivor and perpetrators, but if you just wanted to answer the survivor part, I'm sure that Dr. Sherry and Dr. D would get to the other part too. Yes. Thank you.
So much of what Kathy said, I think, can apply to the perpetrator as well in trying to get the perpetrator to acknowledge exactly what happened, and starting with a question or starting with something like what I heard was, and giving the person an opportunity to speak. What I find, and I've found this for a very long time, that people who express hate in any way whatsoever are typically working from a place of fear, and helping people to recognize that fear that is driving that thinking and the actions is really a place to begin, because people will tell you it's X, Y, and Z, when in fact it's about fear, and fear resonates in the form of racism. So starting with helping people to realize exactly what they're saying and the implications for what they're saying, and utilizing that 4-step process that Dr. Fisher talked about, getting people to recognize that you always have power and choice in every single decision. And when you feel that you have the least amount of choice is when perhaps you have the most important choices, to ensure that you're not feeding into a system that you outwardly say you hate and you reject, but in fact, those actions that are the result of your choices feed into that system, and it fortifies that system. So for me, that's where I like to listen. I like to meet people where they are and then help to have them recognize the tools that they already possess and work from there.
Thank you. Dr. D?
For me, it would just continue with the perpetrator in particular. So the thing that comes to mind for me is like figuring out first and foremost, like, is this an internalized form of violence that now you're perpetuating as a person who is part of that group, or is this a person who is outside of that group, right, and is perpetuating that violence? Because getting clear on where that's coming from will also help you figure out how to address the harm that is being caused, and then inform how we engage in the restoration or repair that has to happen after the moment of violence, or the experiences of violence that happen in that situation. And then it made me think about the scarf model as well, of like, okay, so what are the pieces that this person is trying to hold on to tightly? Is it the fear that you might lose your status, right? Like you don't want to no longer be that token and receive the benefits or the perceived benefits of being that token, or the belief that there are more Black people being hired in this organization. So maybe we need to be careful because my status here is going to be threatened, or that certainty about your space, or now you don't belong as much, or you perceive that you don't belong as much because there are more Spanish speakers being hired here. And now you feel like maybe you're part of the outside group. So figuring out what it is that people are holding on to so tightly and what they're afraid of losing would be helpful, along with understanding, like, is this a person who is part of the group and is this a person who is not? So then we can move to a repair with questions and understanding of the systems and structures based on who the person is. So then we have a more holistic approach to then make sure that not only are we moving this person further in their own development, but that we're also making space for their humanity within this, while still holding space with what Kathy said of how we take care of the person who is also surviving and has experienced that violence as well.
Wow, this is resource rich. I hope that you all are taking notes. Feel free to drop in the chat box what are you taking from what these wonderful folks are saying. But I want to string together everything they shared with you were about long-term strategy engagement. They talked about addressing it in the moment, but they also talked about helping people to think about the roots that's driving you, whether you're the roots of what you need for support as a survivor, then the roots of you are a person that's perpetuating it. And what they're beautifully illustrating is that you can have the 4 steps to disrupt in the moment, but this is long-term continued work. And the last thing I would say is that they beautifully illustrate the importance of honoring the humanity of everybody involved and helping to get that person to really lean in and think, deeper about what's happening. Okay, we'll take one more scripted question, and then we have a question from the folks who registered, and then we'll take a few of the Q&As that we're seeing. What does accountability look like to the satisfaction of Black and Brown people? So how can we help folks in our environment? What does accountability look like to the satisfaction of Black and Brown people? And I'm going to assume what this person was going towards is that, how do we let Black and Brown folks know, like, accountability has taken place in the organization and we're trying to create a racist-free environment. And we'll start with Dr. Kathy.
Dr. Fisher, you cut out just a little bit. Did you say?
I'm sorry. We'll start with Dr. Sherry and then go to Dr. D and end with Kathy.
Okay, I'm happy to start. Accountability in my current context, I would say the number one thing is about a design with model, rather than making decisions for people and determining what is best for people. Have people be an active participant from the very beginning and find out, what do people want to see, what do people believe would be best, and then begin designing with people, being inclusive right from the very beginning. And as far as continual checks, you don't just start designing with. There are checks throughout the process to ensure that whatever it is you are doing in your given context is being representative of the different voices that you are looking to make part of the process. So it is a continuous cycle of designing with and checking with.
Thank you.
Response to
Dr. G and then Kathy.
In response to that question, I ended up having to draw a little diagram for myself because there are two very different ways, right, that we can think about and talk about accountability, whether we mean like how this person is accountable to themselves, right, and the harm that they have caused, and then how we think about accountability for the collective. But then even within that, right, as an abolitionist, is your idea of accountability coming from a punitive place or is it from a restorative one? So then what is it that you actually want to see and where's that coming from? Is that then a further perpetuation of systems of oppression and harm that then continue to uphold those same systems even while we're saying that we're working toward repair? So being clear on where those things are coming from would be like the first step to figure out where we're going to go. But then beyond that, the way to also be able to share and show that accountability is by being clear on what that means and what that looks like as an organization, and creating systems, processes, and procedures to then be clear, okay, so these are the steps that we're going through whenever harm is caused, and here is how we went through that due process as a collective. Here's the harm that happened, here's how we move through it, here's how we talk through that, and then being able to also create a more whole group restorative space for that to happen. So again, whether that is just having the two people who were in the experience together with a mediator to discuss if this was something that happened whole group or via email for other people to see, because very public actions require public accountability. So then determining, again, just the different steps, the different levels and layers would help us figure out what that means and how to also meet the need of the person who experienced the harm in that moment, while also making sure that we're very cautious of whether we mean we want to punish them or whether we really mean that we want repair and we want to restore the space that we're creating together.
Thank you. That's good. That's good. Kathy?
Yes, Dr. D, when you mentioned restorative practices, that's what's standing out to me, and that's what's really coming up for me. So in response to that question, I am really thinking about, again, that self-awareness piece of understanding and mapping out what your role is. Are you in a position of power and influence, right? Really thinking about, is this happening on an individual level, a cultural level, a systemic level? Because that really influences what your response is going to look like. So on an individual level, I know I shared the VAR approach, but something else I like to use is what's called the 5 Ds of bystander intervention, right? Where you can look it up on the side, but distract, delegate, document, right? There's 5 of them in particular as a bystander that you can do on an individual level. So that is another resource I wanted to share. If you're, let's say, in a position where you're managing people and team culture, right, your response would look different there. Maybe a proactive approach would be creating some team norms in the very beginning, right, and just processes so that, accountability, right? What does it look like when we break these consequences, or what are the consequences for breaking these norms, right? And again, co-creating, similar to what Dr. Sherry had mentioned. And lastly, from an org perspective, what do your processes look like if you don't already have a structure in place, and maybe looking at similar sectors or businesses that what are they doing and what's working and what's not working, and really seeing what your role is in that.
Thank you. And there's a couple of folks in the box talking about, part of when someone says something racist in a meeting, as the manager, the person that's leading the meeting, that's going to cause for a direct challenge, a direct intervention. Folks are saying public actions require public accountability. I completely agree. Now, you don't say to a person, that's racist, you're racist, because who's ever come back when you have basically shredded them in front of the entire team? But in that moment, you can say, I want to remind ourselves of our norm. We have a whole video on the importance of setting norms. You can go to our YouTube page and look it up and figure out how to set norms around inclusion for your team. But also just being able to say, like, that comment was a racial microaggression. I want to make sure that we know that we honor people's humanities. People are heard, seen, and respected in our time together. We don't want to create any space where people's humanity isn't honored. So it's being able to, because at that point, that's how the person is hearing, like, oh, you're not just going to let it slide. Now, you still have to honor the humanity of the person who said it. You should not, take that person out in that moment. You want to bring them into the space. Can you help me to understand, Dee, what you mean by Kathy is an angry woman because she made this comment? I want to make sure that we're aware of our language and how language hurts, and language can be used to perpetuate microaggressions, right? In those spaces. There's a lot happening in the Q&A in the chat box. I can tell that this is juicy for people. But let me go to one of the questions from one of the participants, and they said, how would you recommend a supervisor address correction without being considered racist? It's just numbers or application of standard that are equal to all employees, but what if I haven't had to correct this person before? So if I can kind of summarize it here, this person is asking, how does a supervisor address someone's behavior that's racist without being considered a racist themselves, and they haven't had to correct this person before? And then we just need one of you who would want to jump in and answer that.
I would say you start with what I said earlier about what I heard, and open that dialogue so that there can be a dialogue. And was it an intentional act of racism? Was it something that can be addressed directly in that context, or is it something that you need to be able to step back and work more closely with this person on?
Yeah, I would jump in here as a supervisor. And the secondary question they had, thank you, Sherry, was great. Going with the questions, be direct. And the person said, well, what about delegation? Are they valid alternatives to direct confrontation? And I would say, as a supervisor, you don't want to be delegating a responsibility if you were in a meeting and something happened publicly. Now, if there's a person that's under you and that's their direct report, then you, of course, you can go to the direct report and say, hey, like, Janet in your area has been saying these comments in meeting. Can you speak to Janet? Because obviously the positional authority may make the person fearful if the person that's 2 levels above them pulls them to the side to have a conversation. So I would then, encourage your person to lead and have them have the conversation. But what I always say to people, if you keep delegating everything to everybody else, if you're the manager and you keep telling your colleague, or you want all your teams to intervene for racism, but you never stand up for racism, that to me is an abuse of your power and your authority, because you're setting up your team to be the folks who disrupt, but they don't have any cover, versus you setting the tone, and what I always say when we're working with teams, and I say this in both ways, like, one, you don't have to wait for your supervisor to tell you it's okay to disrupt racism or to lead for equity, because you got a job description which has bullet points that gives you 27 different ways you can become a more just person at work. And you hopefully care about the humanity of your people. But at the same time, as a supervisor, you also set the tone. Your positional authority sets the tone. And if this is a case where your supervisor is saying racist things over and over again, if you've approached them and they are not open, then the next thing would be to go to their supervisor or go to human resources or an ombudsman office on your campus or in your organization. Because sometimes they are the aggressor and you want to make sure that you pursue another course of action, but you don't have to sit in it. You don't have to keep taking it. And you should know that, it's okay for you to exercise whatever choices. Let me see if there's any more. Go ahead, Kathy, if you want to take that. I'm going to see if there's any more questions before I put up my last slide.
Sure. 2 things that's coming up for me too, as someone who's managed teams before and situations like that, would be also looking at what your organization's process is for handling situations like that, and leaning on whoever your person above you is, like, okay, how can I best approach this conversation? But as far as a specific framework, Dr. Fisher, she had shared the SBI strategy, right? So when you're actually having that conversation with the individual, really not personalizing it, right? But really focusing on situation, behavior, and impact, especially emphasizing impact, and then co-creating solutions with them.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for our panelists who had thank you for your knowledge. You all can show them some love in the chat box. I'm gonna ask them to, head off camera, and then we'll hang around after I do my last slides. If you have any burning questions that you don't want to ask while you're being recorded, I'll turn off the recording. We started doing that last go round, and it was helpful for people to feel like they could just ask and, not have it be recorded. So they'll kind of come off camera, and then I'm gonna go through my one slide, and then I'll end the webinar, and then those who like to stay for the after party, as we like to say, can ask some of your additional questions. So one of the things that we wanted to share with you all is a community that we're going to be launching in January 2024. And if you click on the survey that I dropped in the chat box, that's going to ask you to give us feedback on the session, but it's also going to be a link in there for you to be able to let us know if you're interested in this new community that we're launching called Beacons. And it's going to be a group leadership coaching community for people in management roles. And it's going to be a certificate credential program. And the community is going to occur over 4 sessions, 4 90-minute sessions over 6 weeks. It's going to be focused on our BOLD framework, which is brave, open, love, and deliberate. And so we're creating this community because we want to specifically work with managers, people who are supervising other folks, on how do you manage and lead people during polarization. And so this is going to be a community space where you're going to be in there with other folks who are in management roles. You will be in these 90-minute sessions. You will have a cohort experience. There'll be 16 of us. And then you will have your own leadership pod. And your own leadership pod will be 4 other managers that for part of our time together, you'll be able to break out into a small group with them, and you'll be able to share any issues that are coming up. And you'll have a private environment for you all to help support each other on your journey. And you can see all of the great benefits from being in the community, but upon completion of the community, you will get a certificate of completion, a Beacons badge for your LinkedIn profile to say that you've gone through an equity leadership development program. And you're really going to be able to walk away with some really great skills on how do you use your strengths from the Strengths Finder to support you with leading for equity, how to have difficult conversations, what are some great equity leadership interventions, how do you anchor your team and yourself throughout what's going on, what are some key performance indicators. So this is going to be something that we're launching as just a response to us hearing from managers saying, like, we need our own space. So if you can click the survey and just give us feedback on how the session went, but also tell us if you're interested. And we're going to reach out to the interested people and send them some more information. And that's going to help us, launch this cohort in January 2024. We're pricing it at $1,000, which is less than we normally would. But like I said, we really think it's important for us to build people's skills right now because there's something that's called leadership paralysis that's happening with a lot of folks in management roles. And we really want to support them on their journey to be strong leaders for equity. And I always end with my Shiro Bell Hooks. And her, she says, true resistance begins with people confronting pain, whether it's yours or someone else's, and wanting something to change it. And our hope with these webinars is that this is our act of resistance, is we are trying to provide people with tools and strategies to confront the pain that people are experiencing in their jobs due to racism and other forms of inequity, and giving you the tools to actually do something about it, to change it in your organization. So we thank you for coming and engaging with us during this time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I dropped in the chat box the survey. Please give us your thoughts on what worked for you, what was helpful. Let us know if you're interested in the Beacon community, because that's going to help us frame our cohort. We'll send you direct information. The Beacon community is not on our website at all. This is something that we're launching new based on a response from what we're hearing from folks. So put that information on, and then I'm going to stop the recording so that we can get to the after party in case folks have any additional questions that did not get covered. Thank you all for coming. You're free to go unless you want to be for the after party and get a few of your questions answered here in these last 7 minutes.